Hi, my name is Joel Behrens. I was the visual effects supervisor for Digital Domain on the Electric State.
And hi, I'm Liz Bernard. I'm a senior animation supervisor at Digital Domain on the Electric State.
So Mr. Peanut was another interesting challenge because, he's one of those brand mascots that's pretty widely known, if not one of the most widely known brand mascots, along with some other popular franchises. But so we needed to stick to a recognizable version of Mr. Peanut. We decided early on that since he was sort of the leader of the robotic rebellion movement and sort of like their elder, that it made sense to make him a bit more of a vintage robot that had been around for a while. So we basically designed him to be an older bot that was, probably one of the earlier models that was made, and who's probably, honestly probably just made for something like trade shows in that world before the robot uprising, to where he would do, brand management and stuff like that. So we went down the road of kind of designing him with sort of the idea that he was like these older animatronic puppets that we, as kids, for me, as a child of the 80s, I would, for my birthday, I would get to go to Showbiz Pizza sometimes, and they had, the big animatronic band that would play, and Chuck E. Cheese was the same way. So we kind of made this decision early on that he would have, sort of a robotic understructure with this sort of foam latex or rubberized sort of skin wrapped around it that would allow for some flight, but expressive
Quick, everybody,
facial
get behind
features.
Teddy!
So he wasn't able to be as dexterous as say your typical animated character. So he had a lot of limitations on how his mouth moved. We designed, we designed him in a way that looked like his latex was sort of cracking and breaking away, and in this sort of state of pseudo decay, so that he looked like he had some age and some miles on him, just to help sell that gravitas and the sort of, he commanded the room when he walked into it. He was kind of like their godfather, if you want to go there. But he was a fun one because Woody Harrelson, who voiced him, also gave a pretty unique performance to him that
Our
was pretty
people are
fun.
free.
Your people ain't people.
Keeping that sort of personality with him, we tried to keep his eyes alive and a little bit more smooth and more human-like, so that at least you had something to grab onto instead of just sort of a flapping mouth, that some of these animatronics and puppets had in back in the day. But yeah, he was a fun one to work on.
Yeah, I remember when we were looking into reference to try and find some inspiration for how his space should move. We found this like old animatronic of, was it Abraham Lincoln,
Oh
Joel?
yeah, the Abraham Lincoln one. That was terrifying.
It is terrifying. And like we realized pretty early on that we didn't want to go terrifying because this character is like the leader of the bots and he has this dignity and this gravitas that Woody Harrelson brought to the performance. And he's a politician. We're like, he can't be terrifying like this Abraham Lincoln, bot from reality was. So we kind of looked at that and that's how we started dialing in some of the features on Mr. Peanut's face of like, here's what we don't want, here's what we do want. I think Joel already alluded to this, that we kind of kept the eyes more human than we might have on another bot.
I think
Uh,
that's what made the Lincoln so scary, was the eyes were
yeah,
really weird and crazy. So
exactly. Yeah, they were terrifying. That's the word. And yeah, so we ended up adding like all those little tiny subtle eye details that you would put onto a human character, saccadic eye
Afternoon,
darts and
I tip my
longer
hat,
held
but
gazes and trying to keep the eyes alive all the time, even though we didn't have all that soft tissue around the eyes like we would have on a real human character. We had non-deforming solid geometry for the eyelids and for the eyebrows, but we were still able to get a lot out of just like subtle squints and little details in the eyes. And I'm really, really happy with how he turned out in that respect. And then for the mouth, you know, Dee Dee is known for, I think, pretty well known for our facial animation, our photorealistic facial animation on characters that we've done in the past. And so we attack this like we would attack a lot of different, you know, facial performances that we've done in the past by making a whole bunch of blend shapes. And at first that seemed to make sense because this character was supposed to be made out of this rubbery latex for the skin. We made a bunch of rubbery blend shapes to try and, you know, simulate the muscles of the face, and quickly realized that that was also kind of terrifying, just in a different way from the Lincoln robot. Like we needed to dial that back also and make him look more mechanical, but not too mechanical. It was pretty tricky threading that needle and like hitting on exactly what Mr. Peanut needed to look like, because we didn't have an exact thing that we were referencing and nobody quite knew where the finish line was going to be. And so, although we started out with like something like 80 blend shapes to begin with to animate the face with, I think we ended up with something like 6 or maybe 8 in total for the mouth, at least. Just like a jaw drop and of the ability to move the lip corners in and out and kind of go into a very slightly creepy smile, but not, again, not too creepy. And somehow we finally managed to find that sweet spot that was Mr. Peanut, that like matched Woody's performance. And I think he turned out great. I think he was the one that I was the most nervous about from the get-go, because we didn't really know what exactly he should look like. There were so many different iterations. I think at one point we even had like a nutcracker mouth, like the whole jaw goes up and down, which that appeals to my sense of puns. But it also didn't really work for his character. So I'm glad that we had the time to like take that twisty road and figure out that character in such detail, because I think that the results really speak for themselves.
Marshall was another unique character to the movie that wasn't in the book. He went through quite a few different design changes. He started out very cowboy-ish. He even had a cowboy hat. They wanted to go with a very sort of cowboy U.S. Marshal sort of vibe to him. And we kept, we kept some of that, and Giancarlo in his performance kept some of that swagger, as well as the motion capture actor Adam, who did a great job of performing him on set. He started out with kind of a normal robot face, with a very small screen that was going to show the operator, since he is technically not a robot. He is a drone that is piloted by a human being. Um, and then we sort of, as we talked with the brothers and with ILM, who was also working on some drones, the center drones and Wingman, Jason Alexander's character, we kind of came to the conclusion that we needed to find a way to tie these drones to the human operators, and we needed to find a way to differentiate the drones from the robots that had their own consciousness. So someone came up with the pretty great idea of mimicking the iconic sort of VR headset that Simon had designed in the book, which has that really long sort of nose, almost like a duck bill that sticks out. And basically, we could use that to reference that someone was piloting them, but not only that, but also display the actor's face on a screen that was on the end of it. So I think that ended up being a pretty good compromise, because you got to see a larger version of the actor's face, and to go along with the really cool design of the robot. And he was supposed to be basically like the Butcher of Schenectady was his nickname for back in the war against the robots. So he needed to feel like he was a bit more of a substantial, like had the ability to really take down a robot. So we took a lot of inspiration, Alex Millay and Nick Cosme and the whole look dev and texture team to kind of had a really good idea of kind of making his body parts and his sort of cladding look a little bit more like a tank. So we had this sort of a brown militarized sort of painted steel panel look to his body to really make him feel like he was tough and, would be really hard to beat up in any sort of battle. So we've got these, riveted on panels to give him extra detail and, with nice, beautiful chipping at the edges and sort of stencil spray painted on designs for like the BPRD logo, not BPRD, the Robot Defense RDTF, Robot Defense Task Force, I think was supposed to be the logo there. But yeah, he was a pretty fun one to get in there and design. He went through a lot of iterations. We tried to, with all the robots, we tried to keep them as grounded in reality as we could with studying how the different joints moved on real robots in the real world currently that Boston Dynamics and other companies create. Um, make sure that he had the proper proportions of the servos and the type of motors and pistons to help support different parts of his body. He's got a fairly significant set of pistons around his midsection that helped kind of give him the sort of ability to gimbal around like Herman. So he was a tough character to crack at first, but once we sort of landed on the design, he ended up being a pretty fun character, and Giancarlo's performance really helped drive that, I think.
Yeah, he gave such a great vocal performance. I mean, he brought a lot of sort of inspiration to how the Marshal should move just based on how he delivered his lines. And so we had a lot to work with. I mean, he's this like built to task like bot killer machine. And so we wanted to make sure that when we were animating him, he felt really powerful, but also still had that kind of restraint that you can hear in Giancarlo's vocal performance. Because he's a very experienced, kind of world-weary guy, operating this drone on the other end. And he's kind of the antagonist for a big part of the movie, but spoiler alert, he's not like all bad. And that was important to kind of get that balance just right in his character as well. That he's kind of just following orders to a certain extent for a big chunk of the movie and not really like putting his own thought behind what he's doing until towards the end of the film. So there was a lot of, again, like with the other characters, there was a lot of sort of subtext to work with that character. He had a pretty well established history that we could draw on. And one thing I thought was really fun to focus on for the Marshal, and also we did some of the animation of the drones as well, the more generic center drones, is to find ways to make them look and behave differently than the bots. So the bots, we've gone to all these great pains to establish sort of their human qualities and that they have these incredible personalities and they're all different from each other. They all have these different lived experiences, but the Marshal and the drones needed to feel a little bit more blank than that. That the humans behind them, of course, you can see the facial expression literally right there on the screen, but that the way that they move isn't as unique and doesn't show as much character. So we kind of intentionally dialed some of the character back. We did keep some of the swagger from the motion capture actor, and also that kind of dovetailed really nicely with what Giancarlo gave us in his vocal performance. But especially with the drones themselves, we kind of tried to keep them feeling as vanilla as possible so that they didn't have too much personality coming through to compete with the bots that were in the film.